Hi, I'm Maddie,
And I'm Abigail, and this is
two writers.
Many Wrongs. Two writers getting workshopped.
All right.
Today we're talking about workshops, the good, the bad, the frustrating, and why we both think they're really important to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You mentioned while you were at AWP that people had some varying opinions on them, if you want to share that.
Yeah, so at AWP there was one talk I went to in which they were talking about how workshops can be very damaging to writers and maybe discourage them from becoming writers, maybe make them quit, and kind of had this idea that workshops should be thrown out altogether. I don't agree with that opinion, but I definitely agree with some of the points that this person made about why they can be toxic. And so I kind of wanted to talk about this so that we could talk about how to facilitate a more pleasant, less toxic environment for
Hmm.
writers.
Yeah, I think that's one of the problems with workshops sometimes is the concept of a workshop is really, really helpful and really important because we have to be able to share our work. We have to get feedback. Um, and as writers, we have to learn how to deal with that feedback sometimes. However, there are a lot of different ways to run a workshop, and some of them can create that toxic environment. I mean, I know that you and I have both had bad workshops where people just, badger the work. But that's not, this sounds so silly, but like that's not the fault of the workshop. It's the fault of the person running the workshop.
Hmm.
Before we dive too deep into it, though, I do want to hear about your trip to AWP, and how it was, because um, at this point, I'm like 25 days away from giving birth, so I was not allowed to get on a plane and go to AWP, unfortunately. But you took so many notes for me, and I want to hear all about it.
Yeah, you're welcome. I like to take notes. It's a way that I keep focused while I'm doing things. But I actually had a really easy time staying engaged. Every single talk I went to, I found something valuable in it and found some stuff that made me think about my own opinions on writing and stuff. It was kind of cool to open up and explore that. And it's also just very healing to be in an environment. And I think we talked about this perhaps last time, in which it just feels like I don't have to explain that I'm a writer. I am a writer, and everyone here is like just accepts you as a writer. And I actually
Mhm.
had this experience where I was talking to one of the panelists, and she's like, "Oh, which booth at the book fair has your book? I'd like to pick it up."
Oh,
And I was like, "Ha, ha, ha. No,
that's
I'm
so
not.
sweet.
I'm not published yet."
Oh, what
But
was, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say the book fair was super cool to go and see all these booths, and it reinvigorated me. So I ended up submitting to a ton of literary magazines after I got back to my hotel. And lately I'd been getting a lot of rejection letters, so I hadn't submitted in a while, and it kind of reinvigorated me. Like I just looking around at how massive the book fair is, and being like, there has to be an audience for what I'm writing,
Mhm.
and maybe I just haven't found that yet. So it reinvigorated that hope of publication one day.
Yeah, I after going to AWP last year, is when I started my website. It's when I started resubmitting places. I really got refocused on finishing my novel edits. And like you said, it's really reinvigorating to go to a conference and be around other writers. Like that was the thing that I loved about grad school was not having to explain like, oh yeah, I'm working on this thing. Like it's more than a hobby, but I'm not making money off of it yet. And everybody at AWP just kind of gets it. Do you have a favorite or most useful discussion that you went to?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think I'd have to look at my notes because I definitely had some that I really
Hmm.
vibed with.
Yeah, last year, my favorite one that I went to was a debut authors panel, and I thought it was really interesting because I think there were five people up there talking. Every single one of them had a different publishing story of how they got to be a debut author. And I don't know, it was just kind of inspiring to be reminded like there is no one path on how to get where you want to go. But
Right.
that's kind of what I missed. I know that you did some craft talks, you did some publishing talks, you did some agenting talks, kind of a nice variety there.
Yeah, I actually think one of the best talks I went to that I felt was beneficial to me was one that talked about defying category, and it was called How to Sell, Edit, and Market a Genre-Bending Book.
Hmm.
And I found it really interesting because there was a lot of talk about genre itself and being put in a genre box that I thought was really, really an interesting discourse about, peop genre authors being seen as lowbrow and kind of talking about
Hmm.
fighting the stereotypes of that. And there's a lot of talk about like the mechanics of publication, how to find a good comp title, how to write good query letters. And it wasn't just like this very narrow talking about genre, but it talked about all these other things that it was new details about querying and comp titles that I hadn't heard before. And I
Yeah.
thought that was just really cool and contextualized by people being like, I write sci-fi and people roll their eyes at that. But I thought it felt good to be in a room full of other people that were writing
Hmm.
the weird.
Yeah. It's so, I don't know, it's so funny to me, people who look down on like sci-fi or fantasy writers, because as somebody who writes contemporary fiction myself, I think what you guys do is incredible. Like, I don't have the imagination to world build, you know? And so for me, I'm like, I write boring fiction that happens to everyday people in everyday life kind of thing. So it's just, I don't know, it always makes me snicker that people are like, oh, you write fantasy? It's like, yeah, bitch, I created an entire world. What did you do? You know? Um, but that's nice. Like it was all encompassing and it didn't just talk about, because I feel like sometimes with those discussions, it's basically you get in a room full of people who get to bitch together. And that can be really cathartic and that can be
Sure.
really useful. But it's nice that they took it a step further of like, yes, this sucks. And now here's what we're going to do about it. And here's how we're going to take action. So that sounds really fun.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting conversation about finding comp titles, especially for
Hmm.
something that you're like, this is so weird. I haven't seen anything like this, and how to
Hmm.
find comp titles for that. And, I think that's a topic we could talk about another time, querying and some talk about how to find and write a query letter, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, I feel like, we can talk about AWP more. If people have any questions for us, they can always, reach out to us on either of our social media platforms. But I do want to, just kind of end with go to any writers conference. Like AWP is obviously one of the largest and it can be really intimidating. But you can find writers conferences near you in almost any state, and just being in that room with other writers can be helpful. We've talked about how to build a writing community, and part of that is going to conferences. And I think that really leads in nicely to our workshop discussion, because you can't workshop by yourself. And I don't know how you feel. I personally feel you should not workshop with strangers. What do you think about that?
I think that's a very interesting blanket statement to make. Um, I don't know, because for grad school,
Hmm.
there was definitely a lot of strangers reviewing my work. They
Hmm.
later became not strangers, but I feel like sometimes the strangers gave me better feedback than people that I
Okay.
knew. Um,
I always think like, I don't know, I feel like strangers can be uh unnecessarily harsh. So
mm,
like in my experience, you find out that there's like a local writing group at your bookstore or your coffee shop or whatever, and to show up and share work with those people who they don't know you, they don't know your background, they don't know anything about your work, can be kind of devastating. Like I think that that is a setup for a toxic workshop
mm,
environment. I think things like being in school, while they are strangers to some extent, you're all there with a common purpose to some, degree.
yeah,
Um, but I always found, even in undergrad classes, and in our graduate classes, you didn't start off day one giving a workshop. You started off getting to know each other a little bit, talking about what you were working on. Um,
sure.
and it, can kind of give some insight to the writer before you start workshopping. Now, I also don't think you should workshop with your absolute best friends. I have a lot of opinions on this.
I mean, that's good. That's really good.
I think that workshopping with your best friends, they are too nice and they can't be objective sometimes. So you have to find the right balance of like acquaintances to really workshop your stuff.
I think from me and my experience, I've had people that I'm very, very close to who are my best reviewers.
Hmm.
I think you just have to find somebody who gets you and like has is able to
Hmm.
communicate effectively. Like my husband reads all of my work,
Hmm.
and he his specialty is grammar. He's very good at grammar. He works in QA, so he's very good at like being really nitpicky,
Hmm.
which can be a problem because he's very, very like holds me to a very high standard. He'll say like there's a lot of typos in this, and it'll be like a 20-page document and there's like three typos.
He would hate
But
my writing.
he he's so nitpicky about it, and he
Hmm.
gets like he's very serious when he's delivering it, so like hurts my
Hmm.
feelings a lot. But he's right, and he's very good at catching that.
Yeah.
And then my cousin Jake also is somebody who reviews stuff for me.
Hmm.
Um, and he is a fabulous reviewer. And I think because Jake and I are probably the same person in parallel universes.
Hmm.
And
You are kindred spirits, truly.
yeah, very, very much. So
Yeah.
he lives in my brain. He like gets my
Hmm.
brain. So when he reads my stuff, he's like, "Oh, I see what you're doing."
Yeah.
And there's no one else would be able to see that in the page but
Hmm.
him.
So, what do you think the difference between a workshop and an editor is? Because to me, those are two very different things. Like the people that you're talking about in your life are your editors. Like my mom is my number one
True.
editor. She reads all of my work, but she does not workshop my work.
True. So, okay, that's a very good point because I would consider what Josh does to be like an editor. I would
Hmm.
consider what Jake does to be a bit more of workshoppy
Hmm.
because he doesn't just, it's not line edits he's giving me like broad strokes. Like he'll send me
Hmm.
like a letter. He'll like do line edits, but also at the end he'll like write like, hey, this part was working for me. This part wasn't really working for me. These characters really shined on these pages, but I feel like they kind of missed the mark here. And so being like the bigger picture.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking the same thing. I think that workshops are dealing with not big picture changes necessarily,
Right.
but big picture ideas. And we can talk more about this as we get into like how to run a proper workshop. But I think that there is a big difference between that trusted person who edits your work and going to a group of people saying, hey, this is a second or third draft. I know it needs changes. I know there's room to grow, but I can't see it. Like I can't get the perspective I need to help it grow. And then to have those people come together and say, oh, well, here are some suggestions of where your story might go. Like to me, that's the goal of a good workshop.
That's interesting because I've had people in workshops
Hmm.
who, when they read my work, all they did was give me line edits.
Oh, interesting.
And like they just kind of talked about, yeah, there was some grammar problems
Mm,
here. And it was like very like
hmm.
it felt more like they were doing like an editing review rather than
Hmm.
reviewing the story. And I think that comes from like when I went to grad school, no one taught us how we were supposed to give feedback. They just said
Right.
read their work and then send them like a page of what you think. And
Right.
it wasn't like there was never an objective as to what you were
Hmm.
supposed like the type of feedback that you were supposed to be giving.
Yeah. And
And
so I
that's
think, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that was very obvious when I got all my papers back. Everyone was doing something completely different and going in different directions. Some people were like really like heavy on like how they didn't like the voice that I used in my story. Some
Hmm.
people were really heavy on like grammatical errors. Some people
Hmm.
were like your sentences are too long. Like it just there was no like consensus of what the objective was.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's how we get to toxic workshops is when there isn't direction given because learning how to workshop someone's piece, learning how to give feedback is a skill that needs to be taught and needs to be grown. And I think that a lot of teachers forget that part. They're so focused on teaching how to write that they don't focus on how to give feedback.
Mhm.
So I was fortunate enough in my undergraduate um, to have a teacher, Janine Capo-Cruzet, who I didn't necessarily vibe with as a teacher, but I learned a lot of really valuable things from her that I take into my own teaching. So like that class was really hard for me because she was she had very, very high standards and very high expectations. And it was, an undergraduate, like sophomore year creative writing class. So it was hard. However, the way that she set up workshops is the way that I set up my workshops when I teach creative writing because I thought it was so valuable. So, what she had us do is you would read your peer's piece, and then she had us answer three questions, which is exactly what I do for my students. And the first one was, what is the author's purpose? And I thought that was so insightful because it's not, what is the story about? We're not doing a plot summary. It's what was the purpose? Like, why did they write this story? How are they trying to connect with the reader? And so, I had this kid write about, he did some haiku poems about different fast food restaurants. And like, yeah, his purpose was humor, but his purpose was also criticizing consumerism, which you're allowed to be silly and talk about serious things at the same time. So it was nice to have our students be like, oh, the purpose is, satire, basically.
Yeah.
Um, and so once you identify what the purpose is, the second question was, what did the author do to help that purpose? And then the third question is what distracted from that purpose? So she really emphasized like, this is not about like or dislike. This is not what worked for you as a reader. This is about the author and how we as a collective can help them better achieve their purpose. You know,
Mhm. I've never been to a workshop like that.
I loved it. It's like I said, it's how I run my workshops now because I find it to be so useful.
Yeah, because I no, like it was when I did workshops like in grad school, it
Hmm.
was what's the plot of this? What's
Hmm.
working? What isn't working? And they also had like this weird ritual they did where you disappeared. You were sitting there,
Okay,
but you weren't allowed to talk.
I love the cone of silence. I do use the cone of silence.
But it would be really horrible when they were like, because it would like
Hmm.
embolden people to talk about your work
Hmm.
as if like you weren't a person.
Hmm.
And so sometimes people would be like laughing and making fun of passages that
Yeah.
I'd written, and I would
Yeah.
not be allowed. And I'd be like, well, and they're like, no, you're not here, remember? And
Hmm.
it'd be like, but you guys are mocking me.
Hmm. Right. And as a teacher, you shouldn't be chastising me for trying to defend my work. You should be chastising them for mocking my work. Which again, that's as a teacher, that's why it always comes back to me. Like that is the teacher's responsibility. That is the instructor's responsibility there. And so like I tell my students all the time, I'm like, you are not the target audience for everything. Like you're allowed to have your opinions about like and dislike, but just because you dislike something does not mean it lacks value. And here comes my soapbox every episode. Um, Men in particular have been taught the world is designed for them. And if they don't like something, it therefore does not have value. And we see it happen again and again and again with
Mhm.
women in media or feminist media getting talked down to or acting like it's less important just because it doesn't appeal to a male audience. And so, I tell my students all the time, I'm like, you don't have to like this. I actually don't care if you like this. Your job is to identify what the author is trying to do and help them get there. And
Mhm.
so when we talk about like stuff that they do well, I say to them, I'm like, were their characters unique and individual? Was their dialogue particularly well written? Was the setting really good? Like mechanical things. And that can be stuff that you liked as well. But I, again, don't give a shit if you like it. And then when we talk about things that are distracting, was there a side story that really took away from the main plot? Was there a character who just didn't need to be there? So like I really try to hammer home to them, like our job as a workshop is to look at the mechanics of how this story is being written.
Mm. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Um, what's one of the best and worst workshops you've ever had?
Um, I think probably my worst it was definitely like my first semester of grad school. It was the
Hmm.
worst I had because it was a very big class and
Okay, hold on,
for
rewind. When you say big class, our grad school was like 6 people per class, but you had a double class, right?
yes. So I think there was like 8 to 10 people in a
Hmm.
workshop
Which is a
where
big workshop.
the big workshop. And one of the reasons I chose the program specifically was because it said that it would be like no more than
Hmm.
4 to 5 people in a workshop.
Yeah.
And then they're like, surprise, you guys get to be the test for this.
Mm.
And like, I was so horrified by the cone of silence because I'd never experienced that before.
Hmm.
Um, and and then they just like tore my story apart and like mocked it and made fun of it. And like, I really didn't get very many like
Hmm.
I didn't get anything that I could use.
Hmm.
Um, and then what was weird is when I got like my papers back, like I almost quit. Like I almost quit that day.
Oh,
I was like, I'm gonna quit grad
yeah.
school. But and when I got my papers back,
Hmm.
the feedback in there was like, very good, very
Hmm.
good critiques that they had, but none of that came out in the workshop. It was like they used it as an opportunity to make fun of what I was writing because,
Hmm.
they all had kind of like they wanted to be like Hemingway, a bunch of
Hmm.
guys, and so they were kind of like they didn't like that I was writing feminist sci-fi, I
Yeah.
guess. And it was horrible.
Um, did you not do workshops in your undergraduate program? Because you also majored in creative writing for undergraduate, right?
Yeah, I don't think we did workshop. No, we did do workshops. It wasn't
You
like
didn't have
that.
Cone of Silence?
No.
Oh, interesting. My both my undergrad and my graduate programs, we did Cone of Silence, and the thing that I like about it is I had a teacher say to me one time, you can't follow every reader around over their shoulder and explain your story to them. Like your story has to be able to stand up for itself.
Hmm.
Um, and it's frustrating as hell sometimes being in the cone of silence, especially when the instructor is not uh, directing the conversation in a useful way. But how is it in undergrad? I mean, were you like jumping in to explain things to people if they had questions, or how did that work not having the cone of silence?
So I don't have as much my memory of my undergrad
Hmm.
ones don't really have as much about
Okay.
that. But I did do a workshop in grad school in which we didn't do the cone of silence.
Hmm.
That I really liked is that was the best workshop I did, where
Hmm.
there were only 3 of us plus our
Hmm.
instructor, and it was a conversation. And I thought it was really nice because they would like go through like a paragraph and they would kind of talk about like their impressions and their thoughts on it and what was really working in that piece and what maybe wasn't working and how potentially we could make it work. And then I was kind of invited into the conversation to like kind of ask some follow-up questions.
Hmm.
And I could ask, like, if somebody made a statement, I'd be like, can you elaborate on why that didn't work? And
Hmm.
ask like questions that kind of help them pull out information that I needed. I wasn't like telling them like, oh, I wrote that because of this. It was more like having a conversation like, okay, so
Hmm.
well, after they like broke apart the paragraph, like, here's what I was trying to do. And they're like,
Yeah.
oh, okay, I got that. And then we would talk about that paragraph and then we'd move on. And since we'd had those establishing conversations, they understood better how we kind of move through the story and
Hmm.
help me get to the point that I was trying to make. But I wasn't defending choices I made. I was just kind of asking pointed questions.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. No, I love that. I always break the cone of silence for the last 10 minutes of workshop and allow the author to ask those follow-up questions. Because again, to me, the purpose of workshop is you as a writer know there are holes in your story and you just need help figuring out how to fill them. So it becomes like almost a collaboration at the end. So like I've had a workshop before where I was like, I know the ending doesn't work. I absolutely know the ending does not work. Don't know how to fix it, but we'll see. They did the entire workshop. No one talked about the ending. They just talked about
Hmm.
the rest of it. And so in my last 10 minutes, I was like, can we talk about the ending? Because you guys have given me feedback on everything else, but like, this is my actual problem that I need help with.
Hmm.
Um, so it is nice to be able to have some of that back and forth to like ask questions and get follow-up from the group is really nice.
Right. What one thing I don't like about the cone of silence though is sure you can ask your questions at the end, but at the
Hmm.
end of the workshop, everybody's just kind of tired and they're done with the conversation. And you're asking questions about stuff that was asked that was like at the very beginning of the workshop. And so they've kind of like lost the thread of it. And it's the discussion isn't as poignant as it would have been in that moment.
Yeah. You're giving some really good points about why to not use the cone of silence. You're kind of convincing me a little bit.
I mean, like I think that like you said, there should be boundaries. Like like do
Hmm.
not you can speak, but it should be to ask follow-up questions,
Hmm.
not leading questions, not trying to get people to see what you want them to see. But if
Hmm.
you need like additional context for your own notes about what they thought, because I think the my professor in this his idea was basically like you're peer to peer, you're talking to your peers, this is your craft, you're
Hmm.
working together to make it better. And you can't make your story better if you're not understanding their critique. Because then maybe they're like talking about something, you're like, I don't really get what they're trying to say here. So, like,
Hmm.
being able to ask questions to make sure you're understanding for your notes, I think would be good to not have that forced cone of silence. But
Yeah.
like I think they should be in the backseat. They should let people like make their own
Hmm.
opinions. I think that this should only be brought up if somebody has a direct question or if that's like related to craft,
Hmm.
a direct question, or if they want to like ask that person to elaborate a little bit more on their point that they're talking about.
Yeah, I love that. It's almost like having like check-in questions of like, okay, before we move on to the next thing, author, what check-in questions do you have? And kind of giving them opportunities to follow up on stuff. Because I would find myself in workshops like scribbling down notes or questions to try to remember to ask at the end for clarity on. And then sometimes it's like, oh, well, that this is already talked about so much. Like I feel dumb asking this clarification question now. So yeah, I really like that idea of having check-in questions because I agree with my teacher. Like you can't sit there and defend your work all the time, but I really like your point of like you are talking to your peers. You are supposed to be helping and collaborating on this. That's really interesting. I like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good compromise too, having the opportunity
Hmm.
to check in questions. And I think too, another thing you could do with check-in is if for some reason it seems like a tenser workshop, also
Hmm.
having a moment to be like, you're right, do you need to take a break?
Hmm.
Because it can be really hard to even if it's like a nice workshop and it's there people are being respectful, sometimes it's
Hmm.
still a little like because you're in that hot seat, like this is my words, this is
Hmm.
part of my soul that they're tearing apart. So that could also be like a temperature check. We doing all right? You want to step out
Yeah.
for a second, need a drink of water? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, the worst workshop I ever had, it didn't make me want to quit like you were talking about, but it made me so angry and it made me devalue all of the rest of the feedback that these people gave me because I was like, if you're missing the main point, there's no reason for me to even pretend to listen to you.
Hmm.
Um, but it was also in grad school and it was in a group of four men. And my story was about a woman who is struggling with being a homemaker and a mother and like all of these things for all the men in her life. And they spent probably 5 to 10 minutes just talking about what a bitch my main character was and like how unlikable she was and how, all the dialogue, like she was just, so grating and blah, blah, blah. And it was one of those moments where I was like, you are unable to take yourself out of this isn't made for you. And so I don't give a shit about any of the rest of your feedback because you're missing the main point. And like at the end of it, basically that's what I said to them. I was like, you guys have completely missed the point of this story because you can't see outside of yourselves. So I did not find this workshop helpful, which my mentor didn't love and the men didn't really love. Um, and like when I met with my mentor one-on-one later that week, he talked about like, well, I need you to write down like, why do you love your main character? Because if you know that, then it'll translate in the writing. And I'm like, so I have to spell it out, basically, you know? And again, it's one of those moments where I don't blame those men necessarily. I blame the instructor for not being able to redirect the conversation into something helpful.
Yeah, I think that was one of the key things in the my really good workshop was that whenever the conversation would skew more into like personal opinion,
Hmm.
he'd say like, and it's like that's not what we're here for. We're talking craft. Like, how is this
Hmm.
working? How is it not working? And but he was very gentle with it.
Yep.
This was awkward, by the way.
I figured as soon as you kept saying it, I was like, I know this is Jason Ockert. I love that man.
So
You got to
so
see him at AWP, right?
I did.
Oh, that's so
He, wa-
great.
those are my, and I was, so James in our writing group, she was in
Hmm.
that too. And like, it was
Hmm.
just such a cozy, such a warm environment. And like, we would talk like sentence level and the
Hmm.
people would get really, we would get really excited because it'd be like, because we would like, I would like write down, I was like, what if I did it like this? And they're like,
Hmm.
"Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, that's so good. And like, we would like kind of workshop in like in the moment. We were like,
Hmm.
it was such a really wonderful, cool environment. And we all wrote very different styles
Hmm.
and it was just really cool. Like we'd write it on the board and like people would be trying to like help me figure out on the sentence level how to communicate that thing. And
Wow.
it was such a cool environment to be in. Like it felt like we were
What?
like writing team like together.
Well, so that's what I was going to ask you. Like, what is your opinion on like what makes for helpful feedback versus unhelpful feedback? Because to me, I hate being given prescriptive edits. I hate when people say, oh, well, this is how I would do it instead. Like, I don't know if it's just like oppositional defiance, but I'm like, no, that's not how I'm going to do it. But it sounds like to you, you love that collaborative level of like, oh, this is how I would say it. Oh, well, this is how I would say it. And then kind of like blending those things together. So, like, what's good feedback for you?
I really do like collaborative writing, especially if it's someone I trust and it has to be somebody who like they have to be taking into account like what my story is trying to say, what I'm
Hmm.
trying to do on a sentence level, and to mimic that style. Like they're not trying to make my work sound like them. They're
Yeah.
trying to use my style and kind of like mostly I'm directing it and then they're like,
Nice.
"Ooh, like this little part is it seems a little awkward." And I was like, "How about this?" And they're like, "How about this?" And it's a very similar like it's
Hmm.
very like nitty-gritty, but
Yeah.
it's like they're reading my work, they get like my style and my writing. And I like that kind of collaborative editing kind of
Yeah.
thing.
I
But
think the
again, it
only,
has to be that they're trying to sound like me and they're not trying to sound like they're not trying to make me sound like them.
right. I think the only person that I can do that with is my mother, honestly. Like, I think that she's the only person who knows my voice or can get close enough to my voice. So I like your point about like it has to be somebody who knows you really well, and they have to be trying to emulate your voice. Because I found a lot of times in these broad workshops, people will be like, "Oh, well, this is how I would say it." I'm like, "Well, my character would never say that, so no."
I also don't think that in that kind of environment where you've just read your work once and
Hmm.
then offering like, oh, you should say it like this, that's not what I'm talking about. Like this was like after we'd been working together for a while, we were
Hmm.
reading this same paragraph over and over again, trying to get it to flow a little better and working on it line by line
Hmm.
together collaboratively rather than them like writing on my paper like this is how you should say it. So
Yeah,
it was very different.
I
It was
love
more
that.
organic.
Hmm. And it sounds like that's easier to achieve with a smaller group of people.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what is bad feedback to you then?
Um, Bad feedback is just vague.
Hmm.
Like I didn't like it.
Hmm.
Or
How do you,
or loved it. This was great. I hate that. Hate that.
yeah. Hmm.
Hate it.
I personally get like a little shudder of pride every time that somebody like underlines a sentence. They're like, this is great. So I enjoy that like in a small dose. But if people were to read an entire short story and just be like, this was great, I'm like, well, that's useless.
But even that, but highlighting a sentence and saying, I love this is specific.
Hmm. Yeah.
I love this sentence. This
Hmm.
sentence really hits it for me. But that's what I think. I think that I like a mix of like people. I'd like for people to point out stuff that they liked and that's working
Hmm.
for them. because it just makes me feel like, okay, I'm doing the right thing. But I also want people to point out stuff like, oh, this, I feel like the character wouldn't say this based on the way you've set them up.
Mhm.
Like, this seems odd that she would say this.
Yeah.
I like stuff
Yeah.
like that.
I love stuff like that. I love the comments of like this feels off because to me, like they're not trying to rewrite it. They're just trying to point out like this is odd. It needs to be reworked. And obviously, the more specific they can be, the better. Like this feels off. I feel like the character was established this way. They wouldn't say this thing, kind of, you know? But like I was talking to my husband the other day about when I grade student papers, and he was talking about, when he was going through school and whatever, he's not an English person, but he hated when teachers would highlight something and just write AWK for awk.
Awk.
Yeah, which like I'm so used to getting. Like literally so many of my teachers would write like awk, or my favorite was just why. Like
My
which
favorite, my
my
favorite is just like something circled and then a big old question mark.
yeah, right. Like I know what you mean by
Uh,
that, but he
Me neither. Like,
hates it. It makes him so angry because he's like, I don't know what you're looking for. And as a teacher, I'm like, I don't know. I'm not trying to rewrite it for you. Like, this is just awkward. So I enjoy that kind of feedback because it gives me a freedom to be like, okay, I know this isn't working. How can I change it and stay in my voice and stay in my characters? Because I get really like jealous of my work. Like I am very like possessive of my work, you know?
yeah.
You're much more generous in your like collaboration and stuff. I get really, really possessive.
I think I think a lot of that has to do with being a technical writer. Is
Mm-hmm.
and specifically I was like our main editor for a long time. So at the end of the day, we had to finish stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it was faster to finish stuff if we worked together rather than letting one person
Mm-hmm.
write it until it was perfect. So we had to like get in a room like, okay, this deadline is an hour. We're gonna get together. We are all gonna figure out how to say this and still fit their voice, fit our company voice. And you
Mm-hmm.
had to learn to kind of detach yourself from it. And I found out that it was really fun and like being able to get really close with other writers and collaborate in that way. It elevated my writing because I was able to like learn like different approaches to writing sentences and different ways of thinking and like different ways of finding words. And I really like vibed off of that energy. And so it's something that I've carried into my creative writing as well, because at the end of the day, like I'm the boss, I'm in charge of my stuff. But having other people be able to like help you on that on a very nitty-gritty level is
Mm-hmm.
really cool. Cause like sometimes you get stuck and you're like, I don't know how to phrase this.
Mm-hmm.
And so like sitting with somebody and like talking through it and allowing them into your little world can be
Mm-hmm.
really rewarding. It is hard
Yeah.
though.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's why I run my workshops the way that I do is that I really like feedback that asks questions of me as an author of like, well, what did you mean by this? Well, why did the character do this thing? Because it allows me to be more introspective with my work.
Sure.
But again, I like your approach to it as well of like you as the author already you have the questions. You know what kind of needs work, and then you can use that workshop group to help achieve the purpose you're aiming for. Whereas with my style, I'm having the workshop group tell me what they think the purpose is. And if that doesn't match up with what I had in my head, I'm sitting here going, okay, well, that's my fault. I didn't communicate effectively. But your style, you get to say, like, this is what I was hoping to go for. How can I make that more clear?
I have a
No.
question. Wait,
Yeah.
I have a question. I have a question.
hmm
Do you think it's because you're a pantser and I'm a planner?
Ooh, that might be, yes. And we'll talk about this more, the difference between pantsing and plotting. But so I am a pantser. I just will come up with an idea and then just start writing a story. I don't plan shit. Maddie, on the other hand, is much better than I am and is a plotter.
No, it's
Which
not about better. It's just different. It's just different.
I think you're better than me, but we can argue that.
My gosh.
But
No.
explain plotting just real quick for us.
Plotting means that I have every single moment in my
hmm
book planned, every
Yeah.
single thing, like paragraph by paragraph planned. I have everything. I know what I'm going to write. I
hmm
just need to do it.
Yeah. So that might be a really good insight into why we like the kind of workshops that we like is because I'm also discovering the story with my readers. And, I don't workshop first drafts or anything,
Mm,
but you still workshop very early stages of something. And so for me, I feel like getting what the reader thinks the purpose is, there have been times where I'm like, oh, that's such a better purpose. That's actually way better than what I was trying to say. And now I could write towards that. But you know your piece so intimately by the time you get it workshopped. That does make a lot of sense.
because I know exactly what I want to accomplish.
Hmm.
And so when people aren't getting it, I want to know like what do I do differently to make you get it?
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't even think about that.
Well, maybe that'd be like an interesting insight to do like as a teacher to ask like
Yeah.
are you a planner or a po
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Pantser or plotter. That's really interesting. Um, the last thing I kind of want to talk about with workshops, and again, one of the things we want to hammer home in this is it is completely valid to dislike workshops. It is completely valid to think that they can be toxic experiences, but they are still hugely important within the writing community and within your writing career. And just trying to avoid them altogether, I don't think is helpful. One of the reasons for that is workshops give you the opportunity to learn how to revise other people's work. And so
Mhm.
it's not just about you as the author, it's also about you as the editor and learning how to read people's work to make them better because it's only going to help you read your work and make it better as well. Do you agree with that?
Totally. I I also think back to some of my better workshop experiences and how they made me see the value of my writing through new eyes.
Hmm.
Because that's it's one thing because I like my writing but I worry that not other people do. But being able to talk about it with people who understood what I was doing and was getting excited to help me finish the story. And I was asking pointed questions about characters and stuff. It showed me that there is value in what I'm writing. And it helped expand my idea of what good writing was and exposed me to different kinds of writing and how we can all work together because there's plenty of space for everybody at the table.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. What is generally your approach when giving a workshop for someone? How do you approach your editing process of their work?
Um, I I very much like to read very slowly.
Hmm.
I like to read and see how each word is working with each other. So I go
Hmm.
like on a very slow sentence by sentence level to try and make sure I'm comprehending everything. I usually do one read through where I take notes of stuff of like things that like stuck out to me just to see like maybe because sometimes it's like they put something that's like and then later on
Hmm.
they answer it and that's
Hmm.
that's good writing but sometimes they have that thread there that doesn't go anywhere. So
Hmm.
I read it through once with notes pointing out stuff that I think I might go back to later and then I'll read it again with the intent of giving a review because I don't feel like you can really do a full workshop only reading it once because you don't have the full picture. You need to go back and look for now with full context.
Hmm.
And I try to balance my comments. I try to make sure that I'm giving like equal amounts positive feedback and equal amounts negative feedback.
Hmm. Do you, I always think of elementary school with like the compliment sandwich.
Yes. Yeah. I do that. But I also have like I was a manager for years, and that
Hmm.
was something that you were always taught to make sure that you give the compliment sandwich,
Yeah. Yeah.
feedback sandwich.
Yeah. That's so funny to me. I have learned through teaching, when I just write my comments down, they can be taken as kind of harsh because I don't qualify, I don't mince my words, anything like that. So like I will highlight something in a story and just be like, this doesn't make sense. But when I'm in a workshop setting, I use those notes to have a jumping off point for the actual discussion to say, well, this doesn't make sense because of X, Y, and Z, and this is what I was thinking, and this is, kind of thing.
Mm,
Um, so I also read through the story twice because I agree you can't you have to know the payoff before you can judge like the preview.
mhm.
And so I will read it through once and kind of like highlight anywhere that I have questions, and then read it through again. And I use the actual draft as notes for the workshop. So when I hand my notes to the author at the end of it, they're not going to be as helpful as what was actually said in workshop. I don't think that's a good thing. I just think that's how my brain works. I think that your way makes a lot of sense because then the author can sit there and look over the notes that you've given them. So I like how diligent you are with your note giving.
I think too that also comes from my experience as being an editor in a
Hmm.
professional environment, because I needed to make sure that they not because one of the things that I would do as an editor is I wasn't just reviewing their stuff to like get like by check marks off so we could publish it. I was also trying to teach them how to write better so
Hmm.
that the next time I reviewed their work, I wouldn't see the same problems. Now, of course, it's very different because it was technical writing, so I had like specific standards. It wasn't like it
Right.
was, you know, but I wanted to help them be a better writer, to learn how to
Hmm.
be a better editor of their own stuff. So I would give really like long comments like you need to put a comma here, and they'd be like, the reason we're putting a comma here is because of this. If it was like a reoccurring problem, I wouldn't do that just because I know sometimes people miss commas. But like
Yeah.
if I saw that like they had a specific issue with not putting commas for this specific grammar
Hmm.
rule, I would include that. But I also like to give explanations when I do my when I'm reviewing someone's writing. I'll be like, I don't get this, but I'd also explain why I don't get it, and
Hmm.
like kind of show them like as a reader, I wasn't just like, I don't get it. I was like, I see that this character is doing this, and I see that and that this happened, but I'm not making the connection as at this particular part,
Hmm.
but they can kind of
Yeah.
understand the logic of why I'm
That's
reading it
nice.
that way.
Yeah. When I'm getting workshopped, I am head down taking page after page of notes of what everyone's saying. And then that's generally what I use to edit my piece. So I'll still look through the feedback that people give me, but I tend to use the discussion base
Mm,
uh, for my edits. So maybe that's why I don't give as much feedback on the actual paper.
interesting.
Yeah, how do you approach edits after a workshop?
Um, I usually I take them and I put them in a drawer, and then I get a stiff drink, and then like a couple months later, I'll pull it out shaking, and then I'll read
Hmm.
through it and be like, these aren't as bad as I remember. But I do like to go like page by page and like look at the
Uh-huh.
edits and mark them. So usually what I'll do is I'll go through each of the packets that I got, and then
Hmm.
I'll go into my Word document and I'll mark all the places where I was told to give edits that I agree with, because
Hmm.
sometimes you have to throw out feedback because it's
Yep.
doesn't work for your piece. And
Hmm.
so everything I agree with, I'll like go through and like meticulously put it in my Word document, and then I'll go through and like make the edits.
Do you take notes during workshops?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
Yeah, I do.
Do
But
those also go in the drawer?
yeah, yeah, they do.
Okay.
Everything
Good to know.
goes in the drawer.
Yeah.
I'm a very sensitive girly, so like
Hmm.
I need like a break from that. So I need to focus on something else.
Yeah.
But and again too, it depends on the person.
Hmm.
Like if it's somebody like somebody a trusted reviewer who knows how to workshop my work, I'm
Hmm.
excited to read their stuff and I'll immediately go through it. But in a workshop, especially if you're having a verbal workshop, which to me is very intense, I
Hmm.
I need to take a break from it. I can't go into it. It's too
Yeah.
soon.
How do you decide what feedback you should take versus what feedback to throw away?
That's a very good question. I think for me, I ask myself if it seems like the person who's reviewing it understood what I was trying to accomplish.
Hmm.
Because sometimes you'll see feedback and it's very obvious that they didn't get what you were trying to do, or maybe feels like they didn't really do a close read of your stuff.
Hmm.
And that's when, if I start seeing a lot of comments like that on a particular person's packet, I pretty much just throw it out from there. So it's like, why is she combing her purple hair? I thought her hair was brown. And be like, her hair was purple, was stated on page two. Bye. And I'll throw it away because it's like you weren't paying attention to the story. So like I'm
Hmm.
not gonna take your feedback. So I think
Yeah.
that's what about you?
I'm similar in that it is the question of like, do I think you're going to help me better achieve my purpose? I don't like just disregarding work because I don't agree with what the person's saying, because sometimes you do have to have those hard truths to like be able to reevaluate your work.
Sure.
Um, but there have absolutely been times where I haven't even bothered to read somebody's feedback that they've given me. Like, we have the workshop, I listen to what they have to say. I know for a fact that they will never be able to see what I'm trying to go for, and I don't even bother reading their notes, you know?
Oh yeah.
So I don't like doing that, but there have definitely been times that, what we do, like we've talked about, is so personal. You have to protect yourself. And so I think that it's important in workshops, you have to be able to defend your work. You also have to be able to take criticisms, but you also have to know when something is worthwhile and when it isn't, because you're going to get a lot of opinions from a lot of people who are not your target audience, who don't understand what you're going for. Um, and you can't let that destroy you and break your desire or your motivation for writing.
Absolutely. I do think that a good reviewer will give you harsh truths,
Hmm.
um, but they will also show you that they are actively reading your story. I think for me, that's a red flag not to pay attention to their feedback,
Hmm.
because whatever it's going to do is it's probably just going to be harmful. It's going to make you feel bad. If they didn't care enough to read your work,
Hmm.
then I don't care enough to read their feedback.
Yeah, agreed.
That's
Yeah,
just how I feel about it.
yeah. Okay, so here's just a fun question. Have you ever been the asshole in a workshop? Because I have.
Have I ever been the asshole? No, I don't think
In
so.
in undergrad, we had a word limit. I think it was like, I don't know, like 2,000 words. Like, not, terrible, but like not super long, just kind of right in the middle. And this person submitted 5,000 words. And I ripped this kid to shreds. I literally said to him, I was like, why is my time less valuable than yours? Your word limit was 2,000 and you turned in 5,000 words. You expect me to spend all of my time editing your shit because you didn't know how to edit it first? Like, I was pissed and got to class like so fired up. Like, I had all of these notes on his paper. I didn't bother. Like, I read 2,000 words and then I stopped. And I was like,
Yeah.
I don't give a shit about the rest of your piece, because that was so arrogant of this guy to think, oh, well, I don't have to follow the rules. Everybody has time to read my 5,000 words. Um, and got to class and was talking to my teacher before it started. And which this is one of my favorite teachers, but he looked at me and he was like, Abigail, you're gonna need to cool down. Like, you cannot come into the workshop with that energy, because he knows that I am loud enough and opinionated enough that I would have derailed the entire workshop and would have just I was so angry. So like, I did say some shitty stuff in the workshop, but for the most part I kept my mouth shut because I liked this teacher so much. But there are some times that that one kid is being an asshole in workshops, or that one person is just being a freaking asshole in workshops. And I am guilty enough to say that I have been that person.
That's really funny.
Yeah, I was
I don't
pissed.
I don't think I've ever been I try very hard not to be the asshole just because I know what it's like
Yeah.
being in that hot seat. But I've never had anybody like blatantly disrespect the rules that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
I,
probably would have done the same. Not I probably wouldn't have been I'm not an angry.
no.
I don't have rage. I just don't. I don't have rage. My
Yeah.
when I feel me feelings it's like sad, but
Hmm.
um I think I probably would have stopped at 2,000 words because that was the
Yeah.
assignment. I'm not going to read any more than that. I
Uh-huh.
think that's fair.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair thing.
And I was an undergrad. I was like, I have three other classes and a full-time job. Like, no. Um, but yeah, so I don't know. I think it's not important to recognize, like, sometimes the asshole is having a bad day and it's okay to just
Or
disregard what they have to say. Sometimes you were the asshole first and the asshole is pointing it out to you. But in that particular case, that kid probably made the right decision to disregard everything I said about his work because I was angry going into edits. I was
Mm.
looking for things to be wrong with the piece. I was actively trying to tear this writer down in that moment because I was so indignant. And I think that that person would have made the correct decision to just throw all of my notes away and not read them in that moment.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think you gotta leave the personal stuff at the door
Mhm.
when you come in to a workshop.
Exactly. Exactly. The workshop is never about the reader. It is about how to help the author. And I think that people forget about that.
Yeah. All right. So next week we're going to be talking about our current book projects, specifically the ones we are getting ready to query soon. Fingers crossed. Kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the process of how we got here, our what our revisioning process looks like, why these are the most frustrating projects we've ever worked on in our lives, and what we do to cope with that, as well
So
as
accurate.
what other projects we have on the horizon.
I love that. Yeah.
It'll be a fun one.
Yeah. It'll be you'll get to see us banging our head against the wall sometimes.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm Abigail,
And I'm Maddie, and this has been
two writers.
Many Wrongs.